Okay, good. Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Welcome back to Episcopal, whatever I named this class. Why don't we start off with a word of prayer? The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Heavenly God, we thank you for drawing us together in a community. We thank you for the blessings, not just of this church, but of our wider church. We thank you for allowing us to be a part of your mission across the globe. We ask that you bless us here tonight as we continue to learn and think about how we might be the most cohesive body we can to reflect the body of your beloved Son. This we ask in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Great. So last class was actually I'm sorry, did you have a question?
No, sir.
Oh, okay. Last class was actually technically the installation, right? Instead of our normal review of the last class, I'd love to have you guys pair up and talk a little bit about what you noticed in the installation service if you were here. If you weren't here, partner with somebody who was. What you noticed in the installation service, what might have been interesting, weird, or bizarre. And then we're going to circle back and have some larger group conversations. So really what I'm looking for is for you guys to mine each other for questions. Get in groups of 2 or 3 on your mark, get set, go. I encourage you to focus specifically on the symbols used in the liturgy and the people who were there. All right, if we come back to big group, what are the things you guys noticed? What popped out at you? What was weird, different, blah, 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 blah? What?
Well, not weird, but it had a lot of lay people involved.
Yeah. So, go ahead. So, yes and no and yes. Pretty much every significant service in the Book of Common Prayer has both lay people and clergy, and when there's a bishops involved, especially when something significant happens. One of the things that's always a staple of that service is that the lay representatives of the congregation say, this is the person we want to call. And in fact, you can't install a rector unless there's lay people to say this is the person we have called, right? That's an attribute of a lot of the services in the Book of Common Prayer and in the Episcopal Church because of what we got back on day one. Remember I was talking about like a baptismal ecclesiology. We understand that it is by virtue of our baptism that unites us in our ministry, and we reflect that in our actual liturgies. Now, there's always lay involvement. If it seems like there might have been more in this one, it might be because there's a newer version of the installation service that actually is not called an installation service. It's called a celebration of new ministry, which we used. It's different than the one that's in the prayer book, but it's another approved rite. It's called what's called enriching our worship. There's a series of approved rites that are beyond what's in the Book of Common Prayer called enriching our worship. And I really didn't have a strong preference between one or the other, but I was under the impression that that's the one that they did normally in this diocese. I was wrong, but that's the one I did because that's the one I thought they did. And there are a few differences, but the differences that they created were designed to try to make it seem, to try to have it be more focused on the ministry of the congregation as a whole, rather than the rector who's just walking in. Other things that you guys noticed? Yes.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
I've never seen that done before.
An installation of a rector?
Yeah.
Have you ever?
St. Andrews ever had it?
My guess is not for 18 years, because you only do it when you get a new rector.
Did we do
Well, but
it for
it's
George?
a 50-year. Okay.
Don't you remember Pete tried to give him a keychain, a Carolina keychain? If he's a big Kentucky fan.
So, but once again, it's just one night, at one time. And technically it doesn't have to, and the other thing is, like, I've been here 6 months and we just did it, right?
No,
So,
I thought it was wonderful.
oh, no, yeah, I didn't think you were saying bad things about it. What I'm saying is, once again, I've already been here 6 months doing the job, and then we're like, this is your job. Like, it's kind of an interesting pageantry, which is also very Anglican to make a big to-do after it's already decided. But yes, so in theory, you should have, whenever there's a rector, there's supposed to be, the bishop comes to empower that person to be the rector. Well, it wouldn't have been on a Sunday. It would have been the middle of the week, like this one.
I noticed that big part of this installation was you got baptized.
I didn't get baptized.
And then you went around and you sprinkled the whole crowd.
So we believe that you are baptized once. You don't get rebaptized. So you're right. But we did. This is a big thing, because once again, what do we talk about as the center of all of our ministry? Our baptism. So a part of this rite is to remind us, is to get us reconnected, not just with the ministry of the priest in this place, but with the ministry of everyone in this place, which is one reason why we went back to the baptismal font, and the bishop blessed the water, and we went through all of the baptismal covenant stuff as we renewed our baptismal covenant ourselves. And then I splashed a lot of you. And if you noticed, when I did, I said something. There's a traditional line that when someone splashes you with the holy water as a part of the celebration, you say, remember your baptism. Fun fact, in my last church, and maybe sometime in the future in this one, I also added a service once a year where I would give the lay people the ability to fight back. And we would have a holy water squirt gun fight. And part of my bit is it goes both ways. I don't just remind you of your baptism, you remind me of it. As it turns out, kids love to drench their priest with a super soaker. But and for that, I sort of use as a model a Thanksgiving of Holy Baptism service that comes out of the Church of England. Yeah. Other things you guys noticed?
The bishop didn't have an assistant with him, a virgin with him this time. Wonder, is that available?
Okay, great. So there's a couple different terms we're throwing around. So a verger is someone.
I don't think Ernest was a verger.
Okay, so it probably wasn't a verger. A verger is someone who comes from the congregation. It's a special kind of layperson who goes through training and basically does all the liturgical wrangling for the congregation. Usually what a bishop has is a bishop's chaplain. Which is the sort of term that's just called for the person who holds the stick for him and stuff like that. And in this liturgy, our deacon served as the bishop's chaplain. Deacons actually are primarily connected not even to the parish, but to the bishop directly. And so there's a particular beauty of having the deacon, especially the new deacon, serve as the bishop's chaplain. In that we also had a representative of the diocese here. The canon to the bishop was here. That's basically the sort of number 2 in any diocese, like to the bishop's canon, the ordinary or canon to the bishop. And this diocese, our canon to the bishop is a layperson, Catherine Massey. Most dioceses have ordained people in that position, but there's no reason why it needs to be an ordained position. So more dioceses have started using professional lay people to be basically the operations manager for the diocese under the bishop's authority.
I know that Deacon Susan is allowed to preach and do the homily. I was just surprised that the bishop passed up that opportunity.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. Different bishops are different about that. But it's pretty traditional that when you have an installation, the rector is given the opportunity to choose the preacher, which is what happened this time. And I chose my favorite one. But technically, it is the bishop has first right of refusal on both celebrating the Eucharist and also preaching. In my experience, a lot of times bishops are happy to have somebody else. And Bishop Sam, as part of the things for the explanations that you get, Bishop Sam sent us the thing that says, just remember, if you pick a preacher, actually it's the bishop's prerogative, so he's got to say okay before you invite somebody.
You don't run the risk that I did one year when I got to hear Bishop Curry preach at 3 different churches. I heard the same sermon.
Yes.
All 3 times.
Yes. I mean, circuit preachers, that's what they do, yeah. But yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question, but.
We don't see the bishop often, and he's not here often, that he kind of missed 2 opportunities, but I understood why. But I just thought that was kind of unique.
Yeah, and he did, yes. And it's interesting, I've been in dioceses where when bishops visit, they always preach. I've been in dioceses where they preach and don't celebrate. I've been in dioceses where they preach and do celebrate. It's kind of funny when a bishop visits and they both preach and celebrate, because then I'm just the Reverend Eye Candy, is what I like to say. But I mean, it's an honor to serve, however, but yes. It is this really interesting balance too. And should you have the new rector do it because it's what they're going to be doing? Should you have the bishop do it because all of the ministry extends from the bishop? And there's no hard and fast rule, but it is the bishop's prerogative to approve the preacher.
Who picks red as the color? Is that tradition?
So it's custom by diocese. So the answer is that Bishop Sam, I guess, is the one who picked red for the color. Now, red is an interesting color in the liturgical calendar. Red is usually used for one of 2 kinds of feasts, either feasts of martyrs or feasts of the Holy Spirit. Holy Spirit, that's why we do Pentecost. So the sort of logic of using red for something like an installation is that you're calling the Holy Spirit to be blessing the congregation as a whole. Yeah. Great. Other things people noticed.
That was nice, all the gifts that you got.
Yeah, isn't it nice?
The picture and then the oil and the stone, and I thought that was lovely.
Yeah, and all of that is meant to be a representation of the fact that the ministry doesn't come from me. It comes from you. Brad gave me a Bible, right? Which is a recognition that the authority to preach and teach doesn't just come from the priest, but comes from the congregation. Ramona gave me the healing oil as a representation of the fact that we pray for healing together with people. There are some standard things. In theory, the bishop actually gives me the water by blessing it, which once again is the core thing that comes from that comes from the ministry of the bishop. It empowers the person, empowers the rector to do baptisms and grow the church and all those things. There's also some gifts that are supplemental and can be added. Actually, the healing oil is technically supplemental, but it's common. Though there's one gift that was unique that we had that I've never heard of anywhere else having, because we made it up when we figured out that George was actually a photographer. And so we had, and it's traditional to have the wall of rectors, right? But we thought it was particularly neat to have George take my picture and then have the person who was last on the wall be the one to take the picture and give me the next picture on the wall. So, yeah. There's no rule that says you have to have a wall of rectors, but most churches do.
Oh, yeah. It's always cool.
Other things that popped out with people.
It was nice that the other rectors came from their churches in our congregation, and the ones that filled in while we were looking for you came too. So it was very nice, that little corner over there.
Yes, in the Strandberg Transit. For the supply priests, I'll credit Pete and some of the leadership here. Was like, they just really wanted to make sure that we expressed our gratitude to them. And it's also common for clergy to come and recognize, because we are one. In the Episcopal Church, I'm going to get more detail about this later, but in the Episcopal Church, there is no St. Andrew's without its connection to the diocese. The smallest unit of the Episcopal Church is the diocese, not the individual parish, which is very different from like Baptist churches or a lot of other churches in terms of how they structure. But this is one way in which you see that, right? Because the people of the area come not just to witness, but because we are including in a collegial sense, right? And throughout all the dioceses, there were people. In fact, there was a priest here who came who is retired now, but was the priest of the church that I attended for like the 2 years I lived in North Carolina, way back when. Her name's Lisa Fishbeck. She was.
I thought I saw her here.
Yeah, she was my priest at.
She was in Chapel Hill?
Yeah, she did a church plant called Church of the Advocate. I went there for a couple of years while I was waylaid in Chapel Hill. So, yeah, excellent. Other things that people noticed. Yeah.
I was really delighted to see participation from our good friends at the Church of the Good Shepherd.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of them came out.
Especially their substitute, interim, whatever else we want to call your wife. But it was
She's their priest in charge. I'm also going to talk about the difference between rectors, vicars, and priest in charges later.
I think it's wonderful that we did this together. It's my dream to see both churches working very closely.
Absolutely.
One to overtake the other, or for those to merge or anything, but to see two strong.
Yeah, Episcopal churches in unison, right? One of the things, I think we got a fair amount of Good Shepherd people who came by because they wanted to meet their priest's husband, right? A lot of people were introducing to themselves to me, were like, oh, we just love Becky. And I'm like, I do too. But I mean, it's a unique thing that we're able to have a married couple and two different churches here. Yeah, that's really lovely. Clergy couples are becoming more and more common in the last 20 years. Great. Other things that people noticed?
I want to know if the bishop's staff is that solid silver?
On the top, it's,
And how-
I guess I don't know that it's solid silver, but it's heavy.
It looked heavy because Prince Susan was carrying it.
Well, and he was having trouble putting it together before the service. I had to get him like little things because it was like, but it attaches like a pool cue, rolling thing. So bishop's staff, what do you imagine it? It's called a crozier, very good. Crozier, what might that represent, do you think? Yeah, so there's a shepherd's staff, right? Which it can be fancy. It doesn't have to be. Shepherd's staff has a hook on one side, which is traditionally used to help pull the sheep that have been led astray back into the fold. And it's also got a point that is often used to keep the wolves away. And oftentimes bishops, when they talk about their job, will talk about both of those implements. If you ever have a dedication of a new church, it's traditional for the bishop to whack the door with the crozier. In my last church, we added an addition, and the bishop warned me. He said, make sure there was one here a while back. But he warned me. He was like, I hit hard, and our door was made of glass. So he was like, make sure you get like a piece of wood or something. So I literally held this piece of wood while he's like, wham, wham. But what was really interesting is afterwards, this is something he didn't even know. Afterwards, I took it down, and there was three dents, and at each of the dent was in the middle of it was a cross. Because apparently at the bottom, there's a cross mark that he didn't even know about, that we just found out because he was beating on the thing. Yeah.
They did that when we dedicated this church.
Yes, they knock on the door. Mm-hmm. That's a traditional part of it, right?
Does the crozier stay in the diocese and every new bishop uses that same crozier, or does it belong to the bishop?
Usually, when a bishop becomes a bishop, they get a crozier.
I thought I remembered Bishop Curry's just being wood.
Yeah, there are a lot of different ones.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's an interesting symbol, right, of shepherd, or pastor comes from the same word for shepherd, right? That symbol that goes throughout the Bible, right? In the Old Testament, there's shepherd like literal shepherd, but it also becomes a metaphor for the one in charge, the ruler, the king, whatever you want to call it. Most primarily, people probably think of David, who was both a shepherd and a king, right? But it's also a really interesting thing because a shepherd in the ancient world was a very low status job, but it was also the language they used for the one who was most in charge, which is actually the way it's supposed to be. The clergy are the servants of God. Yeah. Other things that popped out. Anything you noticed? I don't have a list, but I just like to see, a lot of times the nature of the Episcopal Church comes out in the way we pray. right? Like we started off with that. Lex orandi, lex credendi. The rule of prayer is the rule of belief. And so if you want to know what the Episcopal Church believes, usually the best way to do is crack the prayer book and see the way that we pray and the way that we act around worship, right? So all of that stuff is intentional in terms of trying to make it clear that this is a ministry of the congregation, but you still have someone who is being given this authority. Did anyone notice the letter in the very beginning? Sonny came. He's the dean of the convocation. So there's a convocation. It's like an area within the diocese, and there's always a priest who sort of wrangles the congregations within that area, and that's called the dean. Sonny is our dean of our convocation. So as part of that, he came to read the letter that the bishop signed that puts me formally as the position of the rector. And I don't know if you guys noticed this, but there's some really just like lovely language. It's not just like, you're in charge now, buddy. It's like care alike for rich and poor, young and old, strong and weak. By your words in your life, proclaim the gospel, love and serve Christ's people, nourish them. So it's like this ethic of service, right, is at the core, which once again harkens back to, for me, of this like dual meaning of shepherd, right? That it's like both in charge, but also caretaker, right? Anything else from the installation? Okay, great. So since we're talking about the celebration of a new ministry and all this stuff, it's worthwhile to actually talk about the diocese and the bishop. I already mentioned that the Episcopal Church and Anglican churches are unique in that they, like a parish, does not have its own identity outside of its connection with diocese. Sometimes that's very difficult, especially for people who have backgrounds in other Protestant denominations that are much more congregationalist in focus. Sometimes the best metaphor I've ever found is a thing called is a banyan tree, which some of you may be aware of and some of you don't. I put a little picture of it on your handout, right? These are trees that grow, and as they grow new trunks. It's all one tree, but it's got separate trunks. So if you look at it, it seems like it's a forest, but it's actually one tree. So such it is with the diocese, a diocese. So all of the property is not owned by St. Andrew's. It's all owned by the diocese, and we take care of it. We steward it, but churches don't buy property. The property is owned by the diocese. This matters very little most of the time until there's a church that decides they want to leave for some reason or another, which actually you can't do because you have no independent identity. You can't, the way that we understand the church structure, there is no St. Andrew's to decide we're leaving. So if you did, a whole bunch of people can leave and then start a new church, but you can't take the church with you because the church itself is part of the diocese proper. Now that's something that once again became a big part of conversation when I was in seminary, because there were churches that were trying to leave, and for the most part legally couldn't. There was a weird thing in Texas about some, but the way that our church is structured, there is no individual parish without a diocese. And so for the same reason, for those of you who've on the vestry or served on vestry, there's always a line item that we of money that we send to the diocese because they're doing mission. I think traditionally in this church it's been called Episcopal maintenance, which I'm not a big fan of because it's not maintenance, it's mission. When there's a church that's priest dies, somebody shows up and takes them through that stuff, right? And that's and those are the clergy of the diocese and the bishop and all this other, all of the diocesan ministry is mission, right? And to support congregations and grow new ones. The diocese itself, in this diocese, refers to that as the fair share, which I'm actually not crazy about either, because I want to feel like it's an abundance of giving, right? And I want us to give an abundance, right? I don't want it just to be the minimum standard, right? Especially because it's to mission. So most dioceses refer to that as an assessment. I put a place on your handout where you can write what you think it should be called. I still haven't found out a good answer for it. If you really pushed me, I think it would call it like diocesan mission work or something like that, or fund or whatever.
The last few times I was a delegate, they reduced.
The percentage, yeah.
They reduced.
It's roughly 10% of your operating revenue, and not capital improvements. You don't pay an assessment on building a building. Why do you think that might be?
Does that mean we can put all of our pledge money into the capital campaign? And if you need it,
And never pay my salary? Yes, actually it does. Okay, but here, let's get back to it. Why would that be? Why would improvements to the property not be subject to a diocesan assessment? Because the property belongs to the diocese and it's investing in the diocesan property. We'd be paying them twice, basically. So you can give all your stuff directly to the capital improvements and not have the diocesan assessment come out, but the 100% of the value is actually in the diocesan whatever ledger.
Question. All right, so the diocese owns the building and the land. Like when we got ready to build this church, I mean, we were already an established church. Would we have to have the diocese permission?
Absolutely.
Oh, okay.
Absolutely. And to buy land, build land, sell on it, all this stuff.
We already have the land, so.
I mean, and also by virtue of this letter, I'm an agent of the bishop and the diocese as a caretaker of the property. So
Technically, they could have said, no, y'all can't afford to build that $2 million.
absolutely. And they will, because here's the thing. If you run out of money,
They got
they're liable, right? This might seem like a lot of like legalese, but I want to call you back to the very first night when I told the history of Christianity. And I talked about how there were all of these splits. And if you remember, I made a claim. I said that every split in the history of Christianity, that not one of them was really about belief, that every one of them was about who has the power to make decisions. As it turns out, who has the power to make decisions really matters. There's a particular word that churches use for church government. It's called polity. It just means church government. How decisions are made, right? Same root as politics, which is the same root as people, right? And this class tonight really is about polity. It's about who makes decisions, what, and how. And in order to understand that, you have to understand the way that we understand our household. And the diocese is understood as a household in the family of the Episcopal Church, right? The diocese is a household with different trunks, but one tree. Yes?
So, like, I'm going to use St. Good Shepherd as an example. They were without a rector for many years. Why wouldn't the diocese come in and help them, 2 or 3 years ago, find some,
The diocese was partnering with them and helping them through that entire time.
Okay.
Now, maybe not the way they wanted to be helped. Maybe not the way that some people think they should have been helped. But the diocese was a part of those conversations at every point. Shepherding them and supporting them the best way they knew how. Just like the diocese was a part of the process to bring me here shepherding and supporting the process the best that they knew how.
They wouldn't just say, okay, we're tired of messing with y'all, we're sending X to your church.
Which some churches will do, right?
Okay, so Methodist churches just send people. That has to do with their history. In the Episcopal Church, in general, there's a mutual call process, right? So the congregation, the parish, when it's a parish, is involved in choosing who the priests that serve there, especially those for longer periods of time. I'm sort of jumping all over your handout, but that's okay. So I just said a parish. There's actually several different kinds of congregations. There's a parish, like us. There's also a mission. Missions are either new church plants or they're strategic ministries that are supported financially by the diocese. The rector of a mission is by definition the bishop of the diocese. And they'll usually have a clergy person who's running the place, but their title is not rector. Their title is vicar. The word vicar comes from the word vicarious, because they're vicariously using the authority of the rector, which is the bishop of the diocese. Fun fact, my last church was a church plant. I was the second priest there. I was their second vicar, and then I was their first rector when they became a parish. So this doesn't make a huge amount of difference to most people, to most pew goers, right? But there is in the sense that, so if you're a mission, then the bishop might just send somebody. Because technically you've already got a rector, and that's the bishop, and the rector's in charge of all the staff. But when there's a parish, there's usually a mutual call process.
So what makes you go from mission to parish size?
I mean, the most obvious thing has to do with financial sustainability. But yeah, part of it's size, a number of things, right? And there's a process to both go from mission to parish and parish to mission. So usually what you'll see is for parishes, especially around here, that end up closing, they've gone from parish to mission to closing. Because at some point they're getting some kind of financial support from the diocese where they're shutting things down. So there's different kinds of structures, right? It's not called a vestry in a mission, it's called a bishop's committee. But in a parish, there's a vestry and there's a rector. The vestry is elected leaders of the congregation. They're lay people, one would think. I guess technically, if you're a retired clergy, you could run. But they're elected from the congregation. And the vestry is in charge. The vestry oversees all of the ministries of the parish along with the rector. So rectors are funny. I mean, I'm funny, but in different ways. Rectors are funny in that, once again, everything in the Episcopal Church is just a little different than other things, right? So you might look at most nonprofits and be like, oh, a vestry is like a board of directors, which is close, except for board of directors hires and fires their director, but a rector has tenure and is a chief executive. So So a rector works with a vestry, but not for a vestry. Once again, it's very different from the Baptist churches down the road. If they preach one sermon their board doesn't like, they can be fired that day. It's a lot harder to get rid of me, so don't even try, right?
In Charlotte, a church just got rid of somebody.
There are ways of severing pastoral relationships.
Tenure at a school system.
But
it can be done.
But a rector has tenure and is the chief executive. Now, there's another term that you might hear around Rocky Mount, and that is priest in charge. My wife is not the rector of Good Shepherd. She's the priest in charge at Good Shepherd. That's how she wanted it. A priest in charge has the powers of a rector, but not tenure. So Becky, for example, signed a 2-year contract with an option third, and then they could continue to work forward, but they didn't. But she didn't come in with tenure because she didn't want to. And what's the other thing about priest in charge? She has all the rector's powers as priest in charge, right, for the time that she serves. And she can serve longer than that, but if by mutual agreement. But she doesn't have. Yes. Sometimes this diocese is referred to as time certain because they have a certain length of the contract. But this is also why Becky won't have an installation, which is another reason why I thought it was neat that Good Shepherd could be a part of it. We could have her preach and stuff like that because she's a priest in charge. She's not going to have bishops don't come on to, it's a big deal when you're a rector because you got tenure, right? It's supposed to be an indefinite relationship, right? And because of that, there's more formality around it.
So Good Shepherd's still in the search process, right? Or they...
Not technically for the next 2 to 3 years, because they could reunite, but they're not. To my knowledge, they're not looking.
I want to back up to at Margaret's church in Raleigh. What's the name of the church? St. Michael's. I'm going to say St. Timothy. St. Michael's. One of the associate rectors, assistant rectors, came from another church. He was the rector at the other church.
Okay.
And when he left that church and came to Raleigh, he was then called a vicar. So why would that be? Because he was not. I mean, they had a rector.
They have a slew of rectors.
Yeah, they had a slew.
That's why. Okay, so just like this is a little complex, so if this is over your head, don't worry about it. Just like the bishop is the rector of a mission and can create a vicar that serves with their vicarious authority, technically a rector, especially one of a very large church, might hire a priest to serve as their rector's vicar as opposed to the bishop's vicar. Usually that's becoming more popular in large churches when they basically want to have a chief executive priest. Or like an operations manager priest, somebody like to take care of more of the day-to-day so that the rector can pay attention to bigger picture stuff, I guess. Okay, great. So we kind of departed a little bit. That's all right. So I'm going to back up for a second and get to the bishop because we're the Episcopal Church. We're named Episcopal, Episkopos, that's what bishop, that's the word, the Greek word from which bishop is made. It means overseer. So they oversee the ministry in all of the different ways, right? Bishops have, just like I have authority over our staff here, bishops have authority over the diocesan staff, right?
You're considered part of the diocesan staff?
No, I'm a rector.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, and also, in order to become a priest, I have to make an oath of obedience to the bishop, so he gets his way one way or the other. But anyway, but no, I don't worry. When I'm talking about diocesan staff, I'm talking about people who actually work out of that office. There's canons, other priests that do various things. In fact, I was at the diocese today. They do a new clergy orientation where we do like speed dating, where we go through all the different members of the staff and get to know them and how they can support the ministries. It's really lovely too, and there's a lot of things that are there's a lot of kinds of support we get from our diocese that are probably invisible to most of the people in the pew. right? Like I had a series of great conversations today. One with the two people who are their communications people, who not only do the communications for the diocese, but also assist congregations when they're trying to think about websites and branding and all that sort of stuff. I had a conversation with some of the formation people, the youth and whatever. And once again, they come out and they'll take a look at your program and talk to you about best practices and all those sorts of things. There's all kinds of great and wonderful support that this congregation gets, but most of it is funneled through me as the rector. Now, it doesn't have to be that way, but because the rector's the primary point of contact, there can either be a lot of that or a little of that, depending a lot on how I think about it. I tend to be much more collaborative with my diocese than most rectors. So part of the reason why I want to talk about this is so that you guys can be prepared, because next thing you're going to turn around, I'm like, oh, why is this person here? But the truth is to help us with X or help us with Y, and try to help, because there's a lot of great resources in the diocese for the church that wants to take advantage of them. But those resources are really only provided to the ones that want it, right? Like, it's not about who needs it, it's about who wants it, right? It's even not necessarily forms, it's just a call.
Some of the money.
I mean, when you talk about grants, sure, but staffing support, all those kinds of things. So, this is a great diocese to be in my opinion. Like, I shopped around. I wasn't going just anywhere because I have an oath of obedience to the bishop. And that may not mean a lot to some priests, but it means a lot to me, actually. So I want to be selective about which bishop I go to. You know, it's funny, when I first started here, several people are like, we should be in Eastern Carolina. And I don't know, like, nothing against Eastern Carolina. I don't know that I would have come here if you weren't in the Diocese of North Carolina. Nothing against the Diocese of Eastern Carolina, but this is a really strong diocese. And that was...
How do you know that? How did you know that?
Because I live in this system, right? We know each other, we talk about each other. I know clergy that serve different places. Also, things that are public, like the budget and what the staff looks like. And
The Diocese of East Carolina is basically smaller churches, basically.
Yeah.
Compared to, Charlotte and Raleigh and Greensboro.
Well, and which brings with it different kinds of resources and support, right? So, but I really value that. Like, and part of it might be because, in my first gig as a priest, the rector was removed for misconduct. So I had to figure out how to be a priest when my mentor was gone. But here's the other thing. It's good that we have a system that will remove rectors for misconduct. One of the advantages of a hierarchical system like we have is that there's a lot of accountability. And people behave better in the light than they do in the dark, right? Even good people behave better in the light than they do in the dark.
Have you heard the story of why we're in the Diocese of North Carolina?
Yes, apparently it had to do with a bishop wanting a turkey hunting lease. Yeah. So if it seems strangely shaped, it's because a specific bishop had a hunting lease out here. And that's historically why the lines were drawn. But it makes a really tangible difference today. So getting back to the whole thing. So the short answer is, like, well, you kind of check in on everybody. We have colleagues. We all know each other, those kinds of things. But and I'm also used to being a part of a really strong diocese, because Diocese of Texas is great. Going back to the bishop. So the bishop is an interesting position, like I said, but it's his power, his or her power, in this case his. There's always one bishop who's the bishop in charge of the diocese, often referred to as the diocesan bishop. Sometimes there's additional bishops, like a suffragan bishop or an assisting bishop, but they're not the one in charge. There's always one in charge, and this diocese is Bishop Rodman, which is the one who came to install me. Not that Bishop Jennifer can't install rectors. She does, but but the authority really rests in the diocesan bishop. And the diocesan bishop's authority is also limited. One of the things that's interesting about the Episcopal Church is every level of structural authority includes representatives of what, in the Episcopal Church more broadly, representatives of a bishop or bishops, of clergy, and of lay people. In our diocese, just like our church has a vestry, our diocese has a standing committee. And that standing committee is made up of elected clergy and lay people who work with the bishop. And ultimately, the decisions that are made in terms of major decisions of policy, canon, and budget are made not even by the standing committee and the bishop, they're made by this thing that we call diocesan convention. Once a year, representatives, lay people, and all the clergy of the diocese and the bishops come together, and we have a big party/model UN-a-thon, right? Where, and it's like you come to the mic and you're like, Right Reverend Sir, I am Les Carpenter, the Reverend Les Carpenter from St. Andrew's Episcopal Church, and I come to speak in opposition to the amendment. It's like, and if you remember back to the first class, I was talking about the Episcopal Church was founded by the same people that founded the country, right? So there's a lot of this democracy in the core of the way that the Episcopal Church functions, which is not necessarily true of other Anglican churches. But in the Episcopal Church, it is true. So we have, at every level of structural authority, there are lay people, bishops, and deacons. And that's lay people, bishops, and clergy. And that is important and useful for a number of reasons, not just because we like democracy, but, when I was in seminary, the head of my seminary, the dean of the seminary, said something that stuck with me. And I actually, the more I think about it, the more I think it's true. He said, he was talking about this, that we have lay people, clergy, and deacons at every level of structural authority. And he said, everyone knows that the Roman Catholic Church has had this pervasive, awful thing in its past with pedophilia and priests. Many people, when I talk to them about it, they run to the fact that the Catholic priests are celibate. But the dean of my seminary made a different point. He said, actually, though, it has to do with the structure. In the Roman Catholic Church, as you go up the board, it's all clergy. Here, we have clergy and lay people at every level, which means when there's clergy misconduct, there's a lay person who's like, no, you're not sending that guy to my church or my friend's church, or because they see it from a different perspective, right? And so it's actually not that the Roman Catholic Church that had this huge problem with pedophilia and clergy, it's actually not the incidence of pedophiles who were clergy is not higher in the Roman Catholic Church than it is other places. But the difference was in the Episcopal Church, when we catch somebody, it's over. But in the Roman Catholic, they were moving people, so it was the same offenders going over and over and over again, right? And that's awful. And I'm not defending the decisions that made it that way, but we had a natural defense against that kind of in-thinking because we had lay people at every level of structural authority, including how priests are disciplined. There's a whole process that defends you from people like me misusing our positions. And I actually think that's really beautiful and powerful. It's hard ministry when they do it. Sometimes it's just because priests get opposite a congregation and they think differently. Sometimes it's because there's actual misconduct of taking advantage of parishioners or financial malfeasance or whatever. But one way or another, all that's taken very seriously in our denomination. And any of you can call the diocese and report on me or anybody else at any moment. And in fact, like I am required, if I know of misconduct in another clergy person, to report it in itself. So we take all of that stuff extremely seriously. This is one of the advantages of being a part of a hierarchical church, right? In a Baptist church, there's no one to step in, and there's no one to step in if the head pastor is doing. There's rarely anybody who can step in and stop a head pastor. Same thing with non-denominational churches. Like when there is significant misconduct at the top of those, oftentimes the whole thing falls apart because there's no one to step in. But there's a process of accountability that keeps us in the light in the Episcopal Church that I actually think is valuable. Not just for you, but also for me, because as it turns out, when I know someone's checking my math, I pay more attention to my arithmetic, right? And I'm a good guy, and still, right? Because as it turns out, like a lot of when you're doing the care of souls the way we do, it's very delicate work, beautiful, powerful, rewarding, and delicate. Anyway. So the bishop has a lot of authority, but not unrestrained authority. And theologically, a bishop is actually the visible representation of the unity of the church. So it's not just this parish, but our connection to all the churches everywhere. One of the things that happened in the 90s in the Anglican Communion and in the Episcopal Church is, though the Episcopal Church had been ordaining openly gay and lesbian people priests for a long time, in the 90s, Gene Robinson was elected the bishop of New Hampshire. And by the way, when a bishop is elected by the diocese doesn't just get the bishop they want. That bishop has to be approved by a supermajority of all of the other dioceses as well. And in his case was. And the Anglican Church worldwide blew up. And we were like, and many of us were like, we have been having gay priests this whole time. Why are you freaking out about a bishop? But when it comes down to it, it's because the bishop actually theologically is supposed to represent the unity of the church. So there is actual there in terms of how people might see that differently. Does that make sense when you're talking about the role?
Is that the same time that some groups of Episcopalians formed their own Anglican church?
Technically, what happened is some Episcopalians left the Episcopal Church, then regathered and tried. And it got even more complicated because there was a bishop from Africa who was trying to plant another Anglican church in the United States. And you're not allowed to do that. And it's got a little bit messy. But
they still have those churches, though, right?
There is still an Anglican mission in America, like all that. But it gets into some pretty detailed stuff. I probably need to do some more research before I give you any really solid answers about all of it. But in general, right, the Episcopal Church is the Anglican Church in the United States, and in the areas that are beyond that we count, like Haiti, for example, is part of the Episcopal Church. Great. Nope. And once again, I'm bouncing all over the thing. I'm sorry. All the information's there. It's the same, but I'm bouncing all over the place. So just like the decisions for the diocese are made at diocesan convention, decisions for the Episcopal Church as a whole are made by General Convention of the Episcopal Church. The General Convention of the Episcopal Church is the second largest deliberative body in the United States, immediately following the Democratic National Convention, which is to say it's bigger than the Republican National Convention. The Episcopal, we're that into representative democracy, to give you an idea. Like, we're a small church, but we are big convention. And that happens once every 3 years. So if you ever want to have, if the Episcopal Church is ever going to say anything definitive on anything, it has to be done through this body that only meets once every 3 years.
Ones that approve a new prayer book or a new hymn book or.
Yeah, and in fact, it takes at least 2 general conventions to change the prayer book, because the prayer book has the status of the Constitution of the Episcopal Church and not just like bylaws. So it takes even longer.
Who just elected our new bishop in charge?
Presiding bishop. So a presiding bishop is the ceremonial head of the bishops, so the first among equals, as they say. But bishops are really they're like, it's the first among equals, like I said. Like it's the presiding bishop is a really important job, but they can't really tell Sam what to do. Like, he really can't tell Sam what to do. But he does convene the bishops and oversees the staff of the church-wide body of the Episcopal Church. So,
What's the purpose of the House of Bishops?
yeah. Remember when I said the General Convention of the Episcopal Church? I also said it was big. I also said it was designed by the same people that designed the American government. For good or ill, this is the way that it works. In the General Convention of the Episcopal Church, it has 2 houses. It's a bicameral legislature. Just like the United States government has the Senate and the House of Representatives. And the American government, the Senate is considered to be the superior house, and then there's I wouldn't call it inferior, but there's the House of Representatives, the other one. And in order to do anything, they both have to agree, even though they don't meet in the same room. It's remarkably inefficient, but this is democracy in action. As it turns out, the General Convention works very much the same way. The House of Bishops is all of the bishops are in one room, like, if you would, the Senate of the Episcopal Church. And then the House of Delegates is clergy and lay people in another room, sending things back and forth, and they have to have concurring resolutions to decide anything. So that's what the House of Bishops is. It's where all the bishops get to vote, versus the House of Delegates, where the clergy and lay people who are elected get to vote.
So in the House of Clergy and lay people,
Delegates.
is there equal representation of clergy and lay, or is it more clergy than lay, or more lay than clergy? Or?
That's a great question. And I don't know the answer, but here's the fun thing. It actually doesn't matter because of another rule. I'm sorry. I'm such a nerd when it comes to government stuff. And I know this is a tough night, but whatever, stick with me. Because actually it matters. Because once again, how decisions made matter, right? So why would it not matter the number of representatives? Or like I made that claim. You're looking at me skeptically, as you should, right? This is the reason why. The General Convention of the Episcopal Church, while some people would talk about it like it's liberal, is structurally conservative. It's stacked against change. What do I mean when I say that? Okay, there's a couple rules of the rules of order and the way that it works. One is anytime any representative anytime can call what's called a vote by orders, which means that they take the votes separately of the clergy and of the lay people. This is true at diocesan convention too. If you want to become unpopular quickly, take something that was supposed to be a slam dunk and call a vote by orders, because it slows everything down. But you have the right to do it if you're a representative, right? So, and you need to have a majority in each section, right? So the lay people have to all vote for it, and the clergy all have to vote for it, and the bishops all have to vote for it to happen. So that's vote by orders. There's also another rule, once again stacking it against change, and that has to do with the fact that the votes are also collected by delegation. So if there's 4 clergy delegates from the Diocese of North Carolina, and this actually happened for about Gene Robinson's consecration. Oh shoot, I met the guy. Real time, whatever. Be careful, because I might be a little off, but I think this is right. Anyway, so there's 4 clergy representatives, and 3 of them voted yes from North Carolina. 3 of them voted yes, Gene Robinson should be a bishop. And 1 of them voted no. The Diocese of North Carolina is taken as a whole. That's considered to be a split delegation, and it counts as a vote against.
Even with the 75%?
Yes. So once again, to make change, high bar, right? So it's not, and this is one of the things that was kind of weird when all of the craziness happened on the back end of Gene Robinson being elected, because this is the way it went, and his election was supported by the General Convention, which means not only to have to pass the vote by orders thing, but it also had to pass the delegation thing. So even though there was only 1 priest, I met him, he's an interesting guy, 1 priest who voted against it, it makes the whole clergy of North Carolina is not voting for, and that's the same as voting against in the way the system works. So, like I said, the process is very much stacked against change, right? So it's not like it happens willy-nilly. Similarly with the ordination of women, had to go through the same thing, right? And it went up and it failed. And then it went up again later and it passed. Because the first time it went up, they didn't realize how many delegates you have to actually get. Like, that's really complicated math when you're trying to figure out how to support something to get through. Like, it takes a real consensus on the ground to make actual change in the General Convention, which once again only meets once every 3 years. If you ever wonder why things seem to go slow in the Episcopal Church, it's designed that way. But that doesn't mean they have to go slow in the parish, but the larger Episcopal Church is designed in this conservative way.
Well, you said that changes to the prayer book would have to go through the convention twice.
Yes.
Consecutively, or every other?
There's a first reading and a second reading. I think that it does have to be consecutive.
Because you could pass this one, wait 3 years.
I've never served as a delegate because I'm much more interested in congregational ministry, but so I'm not an expert on that, but I think they do have to be consecutive.
Okay.
Unless it's tabled, but then I guess technically it's still consecutive. Sorry, once again, this is a lot of weird government stuff, but getting back to the whole thing, why do churches split? It's who makes decisions, how and why. And your church has worked really, really, really hard to make a structure that when it moves, it means it. And to make sure that the voices of all the different groups, clergy, lay people, and bishops, are heard. And you can't move without all 3 together. And once again, if you're trying to make change, it's annoying. But once you've made it, you also know that you've made it, right? I mean, I'm not saying it's far from a perfect system, but I think it's actually really, there's some real beauty in it. Because it's so funny, because they took the hierarchy of the monarchy and fused it together with American democracy in order to make this church. And when I say the hierarchy of the monarchy, a lot of the things that we do are actually callbacks to kingship. The word rector, the root of it is rex, Tyrannosaurus rex, king, right? Or even more importantly, the bishop, when you go to the cathedral, what makes a cathedral? A cathedral is a chair that is the bishop's chair. That's called the cathedra, the throne of the bishop. Like, that's what makes it a cathedral. And that's why there's only one per diocese. Look at your face. Yes, that's what makes a cathedral a cathedral, is it has a specific chair that is the bishop's chair, seat, or throne, however you want to call it.
We have a chair?
You can. There are lots of churches that have chairs, but it doesn't make you a cathedral. He gets to designate one. He or she gets to designate one, depending on who the diocesan bishop, but in this case, he. So, sorry, I've lost a little bit of track of time. We're getting close, or past. But anyway, so once again, there is this, I mentioned diocesan convention. I should probably mention that for those of you who came to the annual meeting, you probably saw we elected 3 people to represent you at our diocesan convention. Tim is one of them, along with Reese and Katie, Reese Lee and Katie Keeter. Thank you. So we'll all be going to the next diocesan convention, making decisions. But so and so it's worthwhile to know, like, you actually, like, this church actually has a lot of access. You know, and it's easy to think, oh, we're in this church in Rocky Mount, we're little, but no, we have a lot of access to the diocese and the way the diocese makes decisions. The standing committee often has had a representative from this area, not this church, but from this area. I think she's going off, so if anybody wants to run. I don't think it is Alice. It was, or maybe she is too, but I was talking to somebody else who was rolling off. So they're looking for that if you're interested in higher level diocesan ministry, which is powerful thing. And we need lay people to do those things, right? And that keeps us all honest. And that's what the process is designed to do. Because there's no clean way, completely clean way of making all of the decisions you got to make. But for what it's worth, I think that your church has really tried hard in order to make a discerning body, like, that is deeply representative and brings together the best of accountability and also supporting your ministries. Anybody's welcome to push back with me on that, but that's at least one priest's opinion.
We often say everybody ought to serve on the vestry once, because you learn stuff about the church that you don't think about, like, what your electric bill is a month and that kind of thing. The same thing goes for any time you can serve on a volunteer basis, not like standing committee level, but
Standing committee is still a volunteer job.
Well, I know, but higher level. Like, I'm on the Episcopal Church Foundation, and that was strictly by somebody who was on it saying, don't you want to be on it? And you'd learn a lot. You know.
Or just go to convention once.
Oh, yeah. I do learn about those volunteer jobs, though. It was a 3-year term. I've been on it like 10 years. And the bishop will get up there and say, does anybody care if we elect him for another term? And everybody's like, no, go ahead.
You're getting voluntold. Yeah. Sometimes that happens. Yeah. Before we break, are there any other thoughts, questions, concerns?
How many churches are this diocese?
Good question.
Ish.
How many churches are there in the Episcopal Diocese of North Carolina?
412.
The Episcopal Diocese
120.
of North Carolina has approximately 120 congregations, chaplaincies, and campus ministries.
Yay, AI. Pastor's best emergency phone a friend. Any other thoughts, questions, or concerns?
Took 3 ballrooms to get everybody in there.
Yeah, it's big. It's big.
We laugh because they don't ever want to come this way. George tried to get them to have the diocesan convention at the event center. Not happening.
Give me 10 years.
Good, I hope so.
I'm still working on it.
Because I mean, we're the farthest east by far.
Yeah. So it's not. So it'd be rough for a lot of people in the diocese to come here, but it would mean a lot to Rocky Mount in a way that I'm not sure that the diocese understands.
This actually is the easternmost church in the entire diocese.
Or Scotland Neck. Scotland Neck's a little further east than we are.
Wait,
Halifax, Scotland Neck.
Isn't-
Littleton.
are we more east than Good Shepherd? I don't have any sense of geography.
But one's further east than we are.
Yes, but it's this area that gets as far east, yeah.
We got snowed in at convention one year.
Yay, fun. Anything else? All right, I'm going to call, you don't have to go home. You can continue to hang out, but I'm going to call that a class. See you guys next week.